Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Meghna Krishnamurthy, and on behalf of the State Capacity Initiative at CPR and everyone here at the Center for Policy Research, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Dan Honig and all of you for this very special discussion. So really delighted, and thank you all for coming here and for everyone joining us on Zoom as well. So I'll do a brief introduction and then we can get going. Professor Dan Honig is an associate professor of policy at UCL, the University College London School of Public Policy, and also an associate professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. And among his other appointments, he's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, an associate of Harvard's Building State Capability Program. That's capability, not capacity. And we can have a nice debate about that state capability program, and a fellow of Lahore University of Management Sciences LUMS, MHRC. He's also a senior visiting fellow at Artha Global. So Dan's work is, very widely recognized and made it. I think he's recognized on a number of lists. There's 100 most influential academics in government, 50 most influential researchers shaping 21st century politicians, all the things that will make him embarrassed. But I think the reason he likes these lists, if any, is because actually the nominations come from people who work within government and who work on the ground. And I think that's actually, in all my interactions with Dan, it is to them that I think he feels most responsible and accountable. And therefore, it's not surprising that when he describes his book, for example, which he's going to talk about, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats, it is about how the humans who work for the state often are or can be driven by a desire to help deliver on the things their agency does, whether that's educating children, helping sick people get better, ensuring trains run on time. It's about humans. I think that's actually why even the lists matter, because in the end, lists are generated by humans nominating people and caring about their work. Dan's previous book, which is Navigation by Judgment, Why and When Top-Down Management of Foreign Aid Doesn't Work.
I want to be clear, I didn't bring this with me. It's just appeared today. Yeah.
My colleague Rohit, who attended the book talk for this many years ago, brought along. So this is all of us doing publicity for Dan. None of it is of his own asking. Is a really fine book, because again, it thinks about people and international aid agencies as people. And it talks about judgment, discretion, autonomy, all the things we do a really poor job of actually creating and ensuring. So his new book, which will be out soon, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats, continues some of that, but also reframes and takes the challenge forward. So as he says, I think it's time to try something else. And so you can tell us what that something else is when it comes to bureaucracy.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the warm introduction. I mean, the first something else I'd like to try is to have you introduce me each time. There is such an opportunity. And it's really an honor to be here at CPR. I have read and much respected and admired this institution, this organization from afar for many years. Really an honor to be a part of it. So as Meghna mentioned, as we pull up the slides here, this is a book, the Oxford University Press, out in March. This is also my very first attempt to try to kind of put all of it together in one presentation, right? So bear with me a little bit. Hopefully it's not too painful. The wheels don't come off. But feedback, thank you. Feedback welcome on that as well, on the presentation as well. I think, Meghna has me just right when she says that for me, it's about the humans and the system. And indeed, my metric of success is absolutely, if somebody comes up to me after the talk and says, this has described the reality I face and helped me think about navigating it, that's what I'm aiming for ultimately. Not the journals, but for those of us who do scholarly study, I hope through this book, not just to, talk about a piece of work that I have done, but to have this be part of a broader transformation in how we think about, in some small way, what it is to govern. So how we normally think about it, I'm sorry, this doesn't seem to be working for me, the click. Yeah? Nope, not so much. Is there a way to, oh, look at that. All right, no, now it works just fine. Perfect. So the way we normally think about this is through, and is there a way to get the top of the slide back as well? Perfect.
Yeah, we'll just move this down. We might even be able to turn it, make it smaller, but I'm probably not fit for that.
Okay. Let's see if,
Can you pull this down?
yeah. I think you had it on the more. I think you had it. So hide video panel. Yeah. Perfect. No, not so.
Maybe just put it down.
Okay. Good. For those of you online. No.
Hide floating meeting controls. That's what.
Very nice.
Okay.
All right, there we go. Look at that team effort. Yeah, exactly. So here's the traditional view that I think almost everyone in this room will have seen in some fashion before, right? So we've got principals and agents, the job of principals. So principals could be, the manager, and agents, those that they're managing inside the bureaucracy. And what we've got here, now I've lost the ability to click again. All right, we're almost there. What we've got here in the traditional model is that performance is strengthened when managers can reward and sanction those agents, right? In fact, that's the whole point. The manager's job, the principal's job, is to be aligned with is to force alignment from the agent, right? To make agents do what principals want, right? As my friend Erin McDonald says in her wonderful book, Patchwork Leviathan, the key is to empower the pinnacle principal to observe everything in the system, right? And pull everything towards what that pinnacle principal wants. But what if the agents are feature, not bug, right? What if the agent's agency, their humanness, what if we start to think of that as part of actually what makes the system work rather than something we need to manage, control, minimize the damage of, right? So we know that when we seek to limit discretion, we often get mixed results at best. So I could have chosen many hundreds of papers. These two just have particularly lovely titles for the point I'm making, right? So these are two RCTs. One is called Deal with the Devil. The other is called Band-Aid on a Corpse, right? As you might imagine from the titles, they are both about how we try to control some stuff, and it does not work out that well, actually, because we get the thing we're controlling for. Maybe that's thwarted. In any case, we can't get any further, right? And we know that autonomous agencies and agents are sometimes public welfare enhancing. Even in the literature, there's increasing realization that sometimes principals, politicians, managers, et cetera, are the problem in getting results rather than the solution. And there's a recent paper in the American Economics Review called Individuals and Organizations as Sources of State Effectiveness. I want to say two things about this paper. One, it's a great paper. I know and like these co-authors, right? They show that in Russian procurement, the identity of the organization, the identity of the individual explains a lot of the variations, not just controls. Second, in the year of our Lord, 2023, you can get a paper published in maybe the top journal, certainly one of the top few journals in economics, by pointing out that state effectiveness involves individuals and organizations, right? That is where we are, right? And if one of the things I hope to do through this project is say, we can go, I think, substantially beyond that, but that is definitely true. The people matter to what happens. And if we thought of those people a bit more, we might do a better job of getting government performance. Here's a quote from Vallabhai Patel, right? The All India Service we need a good All India Service, which has the independence to speak out its mind. These people are the instruments. Remove them and I see nothing but a picture of chaos all over the country. I have to say it took me about 12 seconds to find a quote from a famous Indian state maker. I could have, in almost every country in the world, I would posit, I could find a similar quote. Politicians, right? People who manage policy, people who've ever managed anyone, know that the people matter. As a friend of mine from back home in Detroit said to me, Dan, I love that you have a fancy job and all, but if the point of your book is that when people want to do good stuff, we should let them do good stuff and rules get in the way. I kind of think everyone knows that, right? To which my response was, I know that. You know that, right? Everyone knows that as an individual, but we don't manage our systems as if that's true. And that's part of what I'm going to argue here today. So let's think about that traditional view again, right? So that principal agent model that let's force people to do the right thing. So I'm going to describe that as existing entirely in the red root at the bottom of your screen, right? So which I'm going to call management for compliance. And the basic idea of management for compliance is I, the principal, need the agent to do things they would not otherwise do. So I'm going to force them to do it. I'm going to induce alignment with incentives, penalties, targets, rules, et cetera, right? That's going to align them towards the mission of the organization, which they wouldn't otherwise be, and get the performance I seek, right? But there's another way, and that way is what's on the top of your screen in blue. That is management for empowerment, right? And the idea here is, what if I have people who want or could want to do the things that are mission aligned, right? They want to help kids fight forest fires, help the trains run on time, right? In those cases, we probably don't need to seek to control them. We need to seek instead to support them with what I'm going to call supportive management practices, or root E, empowering management practices. And I'll come back to what I have in mind when I say that in just a moment. So I'm going to just say two conceptual things about this E versus C distinction. So the first is, I think there is a potential trade-off between empowerment and compliance, right? So there are some margins on which we could be at a kind of frontier. That's the black line here on this graph, right? Where more empowerment has to mean less compliance. I either give somebody autonomy or I don't, right? But a lot of times, I would say most agencies, and I've had the great pleasure, the great honor of working with governments around the world, I would say almost every agency I've ever worked with, almost every team I've ever worked with, I believe not to be at the frontier, right? So if you're not at the frontier, what I mean by that is you can increase empowerment without necessarily reducing compliance. You could reduce compliance to increase empowerment, but things you could do to empower people within the system you already have, to support them, to help foster their autonomy, their sense of competence, their connection to peers and purpose, which are the three main levers that I talk about. That said, you could think about the ratio of compliance and empowerment, and I encourage you to do so at times in the book. So I think every agency has a kind of hypothetical frontier of performance, right? And we can think about when more or less empowerment or compliance as a ratio is going to lead to the best, right? So, and the shape of this graph is going to differ by agency, right? So the claim here is not that every agency is going to benefit from a maximal amount of empowerment. Indeed, the claim here is not that having no compliance is going to be good for very many agencies, but the shape of that graph is going to depend on the shape of the agency's tasks. And broadly, the more the things an agency does, the things an organization does, are things that can't be well monitored, right? That can't be well described with rules, that require judgment. The more it's going to be the case that the agency is going to reach the highest possible performance closer to the empowerment side of the spectrum. That peak in this two-peak graph is going to be closer to the right? So let me try to put some kind of faces on this, right? So one thing I do in the book is I profile mission-driven bureaucrats, and this is the first of a few such profiles I'll talk to you about today. So this is a woman named Margaret Labanya. And Margaret Labanya is the answer to a question I kept asking when I was working in Juba in South Sudan, right? So I was working in South Sudan, and whenever I go in a country that I do not know well to understand what's going on in a particular sector, particular ministry, particular agency, first thing I do is say, okay, let's look at whatever data we have. Let's look at the census data, let's look at a DHS, et cetera, right? And I suspect many of you will be unsurprised to learn that then I go look at the actual thing, and I often find that the actual thing does not have that much relationship to the formal data that was in the charts and graphs and tables, right? But here I was in South Sudan, country only a couple of years old, country the size of France, and every time I looked for data, and then I went to look at the actual thing matched the data, right? Which is the sort of thing that maybe others might expect, I guess, but to me came as a surprise over and over again. And I kept asking why. Why is the data so good? And I kept getting implausible answers like, oh, we got support from the World Bank for our census. And I found myself thinking, okay, but that does not make you unique amongst the censuses that I've looked at. And the answer, as far as I could figure out, was this woman who ran the census for the new Republic of South Sudan, right? When I went to talk to Labani about, why she did her work, I was like, why did you work so hard on this census? And she said this quote I have here, which is, look, even when God was creating, he must have used statistics. Numbers change people's lives. I need the data to be accurate because this is going to transform the lives of citizens of South Sudan. So, I'm an economist by training. I love data, right? I am not sure that I think God needed statistics when he was creating. I think he might not have needed those summary statistics. But the fact that she thought so, the fact that she was driven by this, the fact that she was, in my language, mission motivated, right, is fantastic. It's fantastic because it meant she did a fantastic job. It's also fantastic because, I know I just threw like a bunch of terms and detail at you. How else would you get this to be done well, right? So, she describes flying to dusty airstrips, right, in a country that just barely exists to figure out what's going on. How would you know if she had done a good job at that, right? You would have to send a second plane behind the first plane to check the data, but then they would be doing the census, which is what she was doing, right? This is a job that, even though it involves lots of data and statistics and gathering, at least the first time and probably for a few times, is basically unmonitorable, right? We will have no idea if this person did. We could figure out if this person stole $5 for fuel, but we couldn't figure out if this person did a good job, right? And no accountability system in the conventional compliance way of thinking about it is going to help us do that. So this is a job where that peak performance is going to play on the kind of empowerment and motivation side. This is a fairly so I just described a pretty selfless mission motivation, but it's not one. So Atul Asadi, the first female district commissioner in the history of Balochistan, right? Batul, when I talked to her, is not driven by, per se, a desire to be the best revenue collector qua collecting revenue. She says, I felt an obligation towards all the females, that if I'm doing it right, I'll open a path for them. If I'm doing something wrong, this will be the end of it. Batul wants to be a role model for all the young women in Pakistan who might feel that they couldn't be civil servants, that they couldn't rise to that kind of laudatory level. So, a lot of people will talk to you about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And maybe there's a little bit of a kind of detailed point. But, this is extrinsic motivation, right? She's motivated by what she looks like to others. That is an extrinsic characteristic. It's outside herself, right? But it's still a mission motivation. And what I mean by that is she's in that empowerment and self-motivated side of things, that root E side of things, because she doesn't need to be monitored to do a good job, at least not by the state, not by targets, right? She wants to do a good job because of the example she's going to set. So what is management for empowerment? I've danced around this a little bit. So in my language, and I'm drawing here from psychology self-determination theory, management for empowerment is management that allows autonomy, right? That cultivates competence, that helps people understand that they're good at something and give themselves the sense of getting better. And that creates connections to peers and purpose, what self-determination theory calls relatedness, right? That connects bureaucrats to results, to seeing that what they do matters, and to each other. As I'll come back to a couple times in this presentation, motivation is a team game, right? To the extent we think about bureaucrats, we think about them as atomized individuals, and I think that's wrong. I think they exist in a system, and that system is not just about managerial systems many levels above them. It's also about the people they work with day to day, as I think anyone who's ever had a job and been on a team would agree with, right? And I think, if I was to say, what do these things add up to? They add up to the idea that the role I have as a mission-driven bureaucrat, as a bureaucrat, is one where it matters that it's me in the chair rather than somebody else, because I have the autonomy, the skill, the sense of my impact, right? The sense of my meaning to those I work with, that if I didn't have this job, something would be different. As soon as we make a job so compliance-oriented that I think it doesn't matter who has the role, then I'm not going to be very mission-driven anymore. It doesn't matter how much I started out with the desire to do the thing. So here's where we're going over the course of the next, I don't know, let's say 35 minutes together, and you can tell me how close I get to that number. I think management practice changes motivation. I'm going to pitch that to you. I think management practice changes who enters and exits a workplace, right? So for the economists in the room, I'm talking about a selection margin, not just a treatment margin here. I think empowering management often works better than managing for compliance, and I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on what we might want to do with these findings. Those of us, whatever career stage we're at, whatever role we might have in terms of trying to make the system work better. So I bring a lot of evidence to bear in the book. There are a lot of words on the slide. I don't necessarily need you to think about all of them. I am going to talk today a little bit about Detroit, a little bit about Thailand, a little bit about these interviews, a bit about this kind of large N data, which I'll introduce in a minute, and then I'll bring in others' research as well, right? So there is a wealth of studies that I think speak to this question, whether or not the authors ever thought about this or this kind of model when they engaged in the study. I try to bring all the empirical information we have. And frankly, I wish it was 4 times richer. And maybe it'll get there, you know, over the years that follow. I see this as a kind of emerging field. So let me start here with a question from a student of mine named Kevin. So in one of my classes, I say to my students, look, you know, the point of this class is to think about sort of what drives development, right? Why countries get better, worse on whatever measures you want. And so what I ask you to do is go out, this is like week 2, undergraduate course, go out, find some data from a country you care about, right? And talk about it. Tell me about, you know, sort of what happens in these graphs and what you think might be causing this, right? Start to create puzzles in your head, you know, start to get questions. And Kevin, who was admittedly not the most humble student I've ever had in my many years of teaching, came back to the next class and he was like, hey, Prof, I figured out a country that's got no problems, right? Everything's been like smooth sailing in this place. It has like super boring graphs. There's nothing to explain. And I was like, all right, Kevin, tell me the name of this magical country of paradise and tranquility where everything just moves constantly forward towards development. And he said, oh, it's a pretty cool country, actually. Its name is Thailand. You might have heard of it. And I laughed, I'll be honest, which is not something you should normally do in class for every student. And then I thought, I mean, you know, so Thailand, of course, has had, I don't know, 17 coups, I think it is, in 40 years, right? It's seen radical protests. It's seen massive changes in direction, right? It's moved up and down democracy and transparency measures, right? But I couldn't deny it. The graphs were pretty boring, right? They did seem to imply a kind of slow and steady pace of development, as if things were getting slowly better over and over again. Why? Why are these graphs so wonderfully boring? Why could the World Bank say, over the last 4 decades, Thailand has made remarkable progress, moving from a low income to an upper middle income country in a generation? Why is Thailand one of the great development success stories? If I just told you its political narrative and said, tell me what's happened in this country, you would say it's a disaster, but it's actually the opposite of a disaster. Why is that? So, you know, I decided to look to where, you know, as an American might say, where the rubber meets the road, right? So district level governance in Thailand. And these are pictures of district governments, which you'll notice are not screaming lots of variation and let's think hard about the humans inside them, right? In fact, they are all identical. You walk into an identical building, you will see a sign in front of you. If you turn right, there are stairs just behind you. You can go up those stairs to the office of the district commissioner. These offices suggest an extremely hierarchical state, and indeed Thailand is an extremely centralized state, one that you might think national politics matters much more in, say, than a country like India, right? Because everything is controlled from the top, basically. Indeed, even the bureaucrats ultimately report up to national ministries, right? So there's a district health officer, and he is employed by and assigned by a national ministry of health, right? There's a district education officer, same thing, right? So you don't need to try to memorize what's on the slide. I just want to show you this is like a pretty crazy way to try to run a district. Everyone is appointed by the center. They have overlapping lines of authority. They're nominally managed by somebody who's appointed by the Ministry of Interior, but that Ministry of Interior person actually has almost no power to reward or sanction any of the people who are otherwise in the district, because to do so, that person would have to go up to the Ministry of Interior, over to the ministry in question, and then back down. And of course, their boss at the Ministry of the Interior might say,
why are you such a bad head of district? They have to come complaining to Bangkok every time something goes wrong. So how are we getting good performance out of the system? Well, maybe the secret is that sign you see when you first walk in, which often is exactly like this. And what this says in Thai is Bambatuk Wamungsuk, which means alleviating adversity and nurturing well-being, is our honorable mention. There's a clear overall mission to Thai governance, and it's one that most bureaucrats will repeat, and indeed modally will say is what drives their work, and most citizens will recognize too, right? There's very little, as I said, compliance available here, right? Bangkok doesn't and can't know what those vertical bureaucrats, those people in blue working in the district, are doing. There's almost no career concerns. People aren't very worried about being promoted, right? They basically can't be fired, really, outside some major violation. And in terms of promotion, there are 878 districts. There are usually a handful of jobs at the next level up above the district, right? It's extremely unlikely they'll be promoted. And if they do, they'll just have to go to back to Bangkok and deal with a bunch of actual bosses. Whereas here they have a job where they sort of functionally are on their own. And because of that, most of them work to get home, right? They work to actually be in the place that they would like to be. They're trying to get transfers to the right setting, and then they effectively stay there, sometimes for decades, right? So 91% are in their home region, 58% are in their home province, 13% are in their home district, again, of 870 plus districts. 13% of them have ended up in that very district that is their home place. These district heads, as I say, can't use a lot of sanction. And that's maybe unfortunate because, when I ask people, does Bangkok often screw up, right? Does Bangkok often ask you to do things that you think you can't do very well, or you think aren't going to serve the welfare of citizens? 77%, I'm sorry. I should say there's a couple hundred bureaucrats across 10 districts who are being surveyed and interviewed say, yes, there's tension a lot of the time. And so what happens as a result of this setup? Well, the district heads are forced to engage in this kind of empowering management because they have no other tools, right? There's a quote from one of those Nyampa, one of those district heads, who says, "It is my job to inspire and motivate people in my district." This, by the way, is a response to the general question, tell me about your job. What's it about? What do you do? And the very first thing he said was, well, my job is to try to get other people to do work, to try to empower them, to try to motivate them. These bureaucrats often resolve this tension with Bangkok by explicitly adapting or refusing the orders Bangkok sends them, right? And by the way, if 40% of bureaucrats, admittedly, we promised them anonymity, but if 40% of them say that they adapt or refuse orders, I think we can imagine that more than 40% of them actually do so when a bunch of researchers from a leading Thai university, as associated with Thai University for this, come to ask them, right? District explains a substantial variance in this behavior. And to their motivation, if we thought of them, if we compared them to the global survey of public servants, right, which combines all nationally representative surveys of civil servants. So this is not nationally representative, but let's imagine it was just for a second. These would be the second most highly motivated bureaucrats in the entire world, and they would be number one on job satisfaction, right? And so we have these highly motivated, often highly efficacious bureaucrats. And why are they highly motivated and efficacious? It's not because of compliance. There's none of that, right? It's because we have a unique, you would never design it this way, institutional setup that basically requires them to be fairly at the extreme of managing for empowerment. The weakness of the Thai state appears to be its developmental strength. So you might say, look, Dan, you just told me about a couple hundred district bureaucrats in Thailand, and that's an interesting sort of data study as anecdote, but does it generalize, right? So let me speak to kind of broader civil service surveys. So I combine all publicly available data I can find that includes measures of motivation and management. 5 countries, over 4 million individuals, over 200 agencies, a couple thousand agency observations. And I look for kind of equilibria, right? So what is moving together? This is observational data. These are studies, right? But what seems to be moving together in these studies? I pre-specify everything. There's a 120-page pre-analysis plan for those of you interested in the details. And this work was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Thank you, guys. So, or PNAS, right? So these all models have survey near fixed effects. There are also agency fixed effects possible with some of the agency level data. For those of you who aren't econometricians, that means we can hold agency constant and effectively say when management is higher, we don't know that it caused it, but when management is higher, is motivation also higher in various regards inside a single agency, right? So here's that thing I just said. I could show you, right? And here's indeed what my argument would anticipate, which is that the greater the level of empowering management practice, the greater the level of mission motivation inside that agency, right? So, when I'm experiencing more autonomy, when my agency, I should say, is experiencing more autonomy, when it's experiencing more psychological safety, et cetera, I also report having a higher level of motivation, right? Or the agency reports having a higher level of motivation, right? So, very few people are leaving these agencies year on average. This effect is too big to be explained by selection alone, and it strongly suggests that, in fact, as management changes, so does a person's motivation, right? We live in a world where we think of people as motivated or unmotivated people, but I think that's wrong. I think we should think about people who are motivated today and unmotivated today, which is not to say there are differences, but no differences between them. Of course there are, and I'll come to those in a minute. So let me talk for just a moment about Judy Parfit, who's in this picture, right? So Judy ran human resources for the South Africa Revenue Service immediately after Nelson Mandela came to power, right? So at the very end of the apartheid era, right? Or just after it had ended, I should say. And so Judy faced a pretty unique HR challenge, which is she faced an agency whose mission effectively had been to help the white residents of apartheid South Africa pay as little as possible while keeping the state working, right? And it was staffed largely by Afrikaans-speaking people who may have had some loyalty to the old regime, right? What did she do? Did she fire everyone? Did they fire everyone? No. The majority of people, through changes in management practice, through indeed empowerment. You might say, oh, these are people I absolutely need to control, right? These are people who are not going to do the right thing without a great deal of compliance. What her and her leadership team said is, look, we can't comply people to success here. It would be nice if we could, but we can't monitor enough of the stuff. So what do we need to do? We need to manage for empowerment. We need to try to convince, not force, these people to behave differently. And so they did. And SARS became and remained for many years a kind of regionally leading revenue service with extremely highly motivated and efficacious staff. And those same people, right? Those same people who were doing the damage before came to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Now let me turn to my hometown, as I mentioned, Detroit. This is a translation of the motto of the city, you see, which is, we hope for better things. It shall rise from the ashes, right? Detroit was refounded after a big fire a couple hundred years ago. And it's a motto that applies sadly fully to Detroit as it lives today, right? And one of the many difficult things in my hometown is the plight of some of the vulnerable children of that town, who are protected or should be protected by child protective services, right? So in Detroit, these are the people who come in to help think about whether children should remain in a home or instead should be extracted from that home and put in the state's care, right? We examine, along with some co-authors at the local university, Wayne State University, we examine a master's scholarship program that tries very hard to select for persistence. Are these people who are going to want to do a good job and want to stick in the job, right? There's an exam, there are interviews with experienced workers. It's very hard to get a scholarship for social work. And because of that, even though the job of being a CPS officer is incredibly hard, the applicants accepted ratio is over 20 to 1, right? This is an extremely hard program to get into. Then you graduate, you go work for the city of Detroit, and you find that your management practice is overwhelmingly focused on compliance, that your incentive is to, as they say in the agency, to pull kids, to extract kids from their homes and to put them in state care. This management on compliance, as you might imagine, is extremely demotivating for those very people who you have just selected for, right? So it's like you've just selected for the kind of potential mission-driven bureaucrat who is going to be most upset if they then can't do the job. Indeed, a bad enough outcome for kids has in the past led to prosecution of the workers, right? So if something bad happens to a kid before they're put in the state's care, you can be held criminally liable, right? You cannot be held criminally liable for extracting them from a home and putting them in a woefully under-resourced foster care system. And you can see the incentives that creates, right? And as a result, the most mission-motivated workers leave. Greater mission motivations associated with a reduction in staying in the job, right? And a great number of people, the modal day of quitting for the scholarship. So if you don't stay for a year, you have to pay back the scholarship. The modal length of service of scholarship recipients is 1 year. Not 1 year and 1 day, 1 year. They quit the first day that they can, a great number of them, right? Here's a quote from one of these quitters. When I started, I was freaked out. There's no room for error. I didn't know what way was up or down. My colleagues are jaded. I don't want to become jaded. So I left. I did some ride-alongs here. I couldn't do this job. I couldn't do it. I'm not tough enough. I could not handle going into homes and thinking about vulnerable children every day. I would find it too depressing, too tragic. Here are people who are willing to do that, who are willing to put in the work, who despite almost certainly having skills that would be better remunerated doing something else, are willing to do this job. They are willing to put up with almost anything except not being able to do the job that they want to do. That will get them to leave. And that's the system we live in here. So I've shown you an extreme, and now let me just talk about the kind of general phenomenon. What I just described in particular, here it is in general. The greater the level of one's mission motivation, the greater the level, the greater the responsiveness of that individual to management practice in terms of wanting to leave, right? People who don't care about the mission don't really care about how they're managed vis-a-vis the mission. People who care about the mission want to be able to be given the ability to complete that mission. And when they aren't, they get out of that agency, right? Just illustrating this with a kind of personal story. So this picture is taken by me directly on an evacuation flight from Senegal to Washington, D.C. during COVID. So when COVID started, I was living in Senegal. Senegal closed its borders. I and many other frightened Americans boarded an evacuation flight, everyone in full medical garb like this, right? To take us home. It's the only time I've ever seen a bureaucrat get a round of applause, actually. So somebody asked if the guy was getting paid overtime for this, and he said, "No, this is my job. This is why I do the job. I'm honored to be able to help you get home in this circumstance." When I went back and interviewed this gentleman, C.J. Roberts, he said, "Look, if I didn't feel like I was accomplishing anything here, and I didn't feel like I was trusted, I probably wouldn't be long for this job. No one would." And I think in saying that, he speaks for mission-driven bureaucrats everywhere around the world. So let me talk a little bit about the kind of performance implications of this, right? So as you'll remember, my model would suggest that we should get more returns to managing for empowerment when we have a greater need for judgment, right? When it's harder to measure and monitor the task. Well, let's look at the few places that we've gotten kind of a head-to-head, what about a little bit more management for empowerment as compared to more management for compliance sort of thing. And by the way, we could use another 100 studies in this space for anyone interested in doing them. And I'm sure when we have those 100 studies, I will be able to paint a more precise picture than I am today. But as always, we're limited by the data we have. So let's see where that data points, right? This is a study about Pakistani health workers, right? So Yasser Khan, who's at University of Pittsburgh, runs a study in which one set of Pakistani health workers is given more money if they do more home visits. So this is postnatal care, right? So we're doing growth monitoring, the kind of thing that I suspect is rather familiar to this audience, right? So the second group is not given any more money. Instead, they are given 3 meetings in which they meet with their colleagues and talk about why they do the job. And when I first heard about this study, before I heard about the results, I have to be honest, I was like, oh, I'm a little worried about that, because I kind of want to argue we should do more things like get people together to talk about their mission, but like, I don't know, 20% of your salary, 3 one-hour meetings. I don't think we're comparing like and like here. I'm worried we're going to be, in the language of economics, underpowered, right? We're not going to get a result here, right? I was wrong. I was dead wrong. So the people who are rewarded financially, they do more home visits than the people who aren't. That's right. What I was wrong about is that translates into more health for the kids, right? The people who do more home visits do beat the baseline in terms of showing up at more homes. They don't really beat the baseline in terms of helping kids get healthy, because we can monitor the home visit, but now I have an incentive to do as many home visits as possible. And that means I'm going to be quick, right? The people who are reminded of what they do the job, how they do the job, right? This, by the way, is an example of a managing for empowerment practice. It doesn't require any formal change in the rules, right? Nothing else changed. Authorizing environment the same, reporting the same, money, compensation, performance management, all identical. But just by getting people together to talk about the mission, right? By just by reminding them, this is why we do the work, this is what we're trying to do together, right? I believe it's like an 18% improvement in the health of children who are treated by these now more mission-motivated community health workers. And I gotta say, if 3 one-hour meetings can produce that kind of result, it suggests to me there may be some low-hanging fruit in that setting, and maybe in many others to think about there. So more broadly, here's a paper that looks at Nigerian infrastructure and finds that there's better performance in Nigerian infrastructure projects with more autonomy and less incentives and top-down controls. I'll come back to issues of corruption, but I do want to flag this because we might not think of Nigerian infrastructure delivering bureaucrats as the most obvious group of people we might want to give more empowerment and less control to, but it seems to work pretty well here. In Ghana, we find similar effects, or others find similar effects. And indeed, the argument here is quite similar to what I put in theoretically. That is, we'll get better performance, especially for tasks that are ill-suited to predefined monitoring, right? And finally, in procurement, more autonomy for frontline procurement agents yields better performance results than does a pay-for-performance scheme. I call this in the text here a high bar test. And I mean that because if you had asked me, where is managing for empowerment maybe least likely to be useful, I might have said something to you like procurement of basic goods where we can monitor the quality, right? But that's not the case here, right? I, in fact, have a little bit of trouble explaining this result, not because it undermines my theory in some sense, but it implies a greater universality to my theory than I myself wish to imply. What do I think we're seeing here? How do I explain this too good result? Well, to me, it points to just how much managing for compliance we have, right? So if you remember the shape of those graphs before, I would like to suggest that even for tasks where more compliance is probably going to lead to the best possible performance, we have more again than we need, right? We still have too much compliance as a ratio. We have too much what in work with Lamp Pritchett I've called accounting-based accountability. Too many rules, too many circulars, too many targets, too many metrics, even in these situations, right? So why do I love this image, which admittedly I just found just before this talk, so you can tell me this is terrible and no one else will ever see it. But I love this image because this guy is pulling as hard as he can on the lever. And I kind of think that we've got a compliance lever and we have been pulling on it just as hard as we possibly can for 40 years, right? And I do not think this is a useless lever. I'm not even opposed to the existence of the lever. I think it needs to exist, right? I just mean to say that things we could have solved by pulling this lever real hard, we've solved. If we haven't solved it yet, it's probably because pulling this lever real hard is not the best route forward. And we probably need to try something else. And if I could say, we might need to try something else, even where pulling this lever works a little bit, right? So, a paper that I hope is well read and well known here is a paper by Esther Duflo and co-authors, which has the brilliant title, Incentives Work, right? What do incentives work to do? They work to get teachers who are not showing up to class to show up to class. And what does it mean for them to work? Well, they have to take pictures, right? And if they take pictures of themselves in the classroom, they get paid. And if they don't They aren't. You might be unsurprised to learn that if you tell someone you're not going to be paid unless you take a picture of yourself in the classroom, they'll take a picture, they'll show up. And indeed, it is also the case that this study finds that getting the teachers to show up in the classroom leads to those teachers teaching students better than the absence of those teachers, right? So it turns out having a teacher, even a teacher who needs a camera to show up to the classroom, does lead to better education than having no teacher in the classroom, right? Here's my question. Where do we go next, right? So now we've got the teacher in the classroom. What's the next step? So if this performance improvement is the first step on a long journey, I am on board. I am excited. Let's get going, right? But what else can we monitor well enough? What else are we going to get done with compliance? And what have we done to this system, right? Let's think about the labor market part of it I was just talking about. Now we have teachers who are comfortable with knowing they have to take pictures of themselves in the classroom to get paid. And it turns out that where this system was, that improves education. And I'm happy about that. But, you know, I think I work out in the book that it adds about another 12 words of knowledge to the average secondary school finishers ACER scores, right? So 12 words is great. I'm not, people are laughing as if this is nothing. It's not nothing. It's actually a pretty good improvement for an education intervention, but it's certainly not enough to have a thriving education system. And so the question whenever we change any system, whether it's a bureaucratic system or any other, is not just, has it gotten better? It's where have we left the system, right? System started somewhere, it's ended somewhere. What are we doing in that system? I have here a graph that suggests maybe this has led to the system in the wrong direction, not the right one. I could be entirely wrong about this. You could model this another way, but we should be modeling it some way. We should be thinking about where systems start and where they end, not just whether performance got better over time. And if we start thinking about that, maybe we should start thinking differently about what I, in my classes, call the C word, that is corruption and alternative accountability, right? This is a little small, I'm sorry. But, you know, we see attempts here in India, in Chhattisgarh. There's this wonderful paper by Garg and Pandey. But also in the book, I talk at length about the UK community of Gateshead, which is a local authority. Think of it like a district in the UK, where accountability for some services is centered on the citizen, not the reporting, right? Where the point of being accountable is to make sure the citizen whose job it is for you to serve is happy with the service you provide, right? And that, what does that do? Well, it liberates a whole bunch of things, right? If I'm just trying to satisfy, I'm a social worker, I'm just trying to make sure the citizen feels right. Well, you know, all of these little practices show up, right? So, you know, I gave the citizen money to make sure that they could pay their bus fare, which otherwise they wouldn't be able to do, so they could get to the job so they didn't lose it, right? I gave the citizen, you know, they were feeling socially isolated, so we went out for lunch, right? What happens as a result? Massive savings on long-term care, right? So this program saves a tremendous amount of money for the community of Gateshead as time goes on. So I've just told you this story about this about these community health workers. It's not, right? You could think about this. I just told you about it as an intervention, but it also is an accountability intervention, because what it did is it reminded me, the community health worker, oh yeah, I'm part of a collective. I'm part of a group of people trying to do something together. And I suspect, to my knowledge, no one's done this, but I suspect if you went back and talked to the folks now doing the job better, they would tell you that they feel a closer connection to their peers, in addition to their purpose. So in Seattle, inspectors, right, are taught to kind of train their judgment and discretion with peer accompaniment, right? Food inspectors, simple intervention. Food inspectors used to go out individually, figure out whether the food was safe or not. Now they go out in pairs. So they don't report on each other. There's no kind of making sure no one's stealing the food or getting a kickback. That's not the idea here. The idea is just like, let's figure it out together. There are a lot of judgment calls to be made here. Let's remember that we're part of a collective, right? And this is very careful ethnographic work over 4 or 5 years. I suspect a few people in this room will have already thought of Akshay Mangla's wonderful new book about deliberative norms, right? So deliberative norms are a mode of organizational being, right? They're a way of thinking about what it is we're doing, we're working, we're debating, we're discussing. They're also an accountability technology, right? They're a way of us talking to each other, feeling ourselves to be a team, a community, an organization. Motivation, accountability, and performance are all team games. The idea of an atomized bureaucrat makes as much sense as the idea of an atomized citizen, right? Citizens live in societies, they live in communities. We can think of them individually sometimes, and we should. Same for bureaucrats, but they exist in a community. And if we miss that, it's going to be a lot harder to get the state to perform better. We haven't gotten to zero on corruption, I think we've noticed, right? So, and that's not for lack of trying through compliance, right? And I would submit that here too, actually, our compliance-based approaches, our attempt to minimize corruption at every turn, in addition to perhaps undermining performance. In fact, I'm arguing certainly undermining performance. I'm not even sure it does the best possible job on corruption, on the thing it seeks to reduce. There's a whole lot of literature which boils down to, I think, the simple statement that people who don't want to be corrupt will be less corrupt than people who want to be corrupt. So it would probably be a good idea if we made people want to be less corrupt and recruited, retained people who felt that way in the first place, right? And I, by the way, dislike the word corruption as a kind of a general thing. It can mean too many things, but whatever your definition is, I would like you to insert it here. Mission-driven bureaucrats and cultivating them, attracting and retaining them is itself an anti-corruption strategy, because the more mission-driven those bureaucrats are, the less likely they are to engage in these behaviors. So I'm coming to the end now. But let me just give you the boring sort of academic version first of what I think some of the key takeaways here are. I think we're going to get better performance with less control. I think we need to consider the costs in addition to the benefits of top-down management for compliance. I think we need to think about empowering management as an input, not just a response to good performance. If we wait around to give the high performers more autonomy, fine, they'll do fine with more autonomy. But there are a whole bunch of people who would have been higher performers had we given it to them ex ante, and we're not gonna see that if we only use it as a reward. And when more empowerment is superior for performance, we need to recruit and manage for it, for mission, motivation, and purpose. I think we're wrong about a whole bunch of things that I think conversations, rooms I'm in at least, maybe you're in better rooms than me, but the rooms I'm in suggest we don't know, right? So I think stuff can get better even where we can't control well enough. Indeed, maybe primarily so, right? That better performance with less compliance means that saying, oh, we don't have the tools to monitor, we should say our response to that insight should be fantastic, not oh no, right? And I think it's not right now. That welfare enhancing bureaucrats aren't just dutiful agents, right? That the goal here isn't just to get every bureaucrat to follow instructions as tightly as possible. That the people we see as unmotivated are sometimes just demotivated. The number of times I have been with a manager of a team, of an agency, of a ministry, and they said, these people aren't going to work. And I said, oh, well, let's find out. Let's give it a shot. And each and every time that's happened, and we've managed to try something in the agency that actually changes management practice, I'm not here to tell you that every one of those people who were, quote, unmotivated has turned into a mission-driven bureaucrat superstar. What I'm here to tell you is that it has never been the case that none of them did. And unless you know the human soul better than 99.9% of managers I've ever encountered, I suspect you don't either when you look at somebody not working hard. So let's try the easy thing. Let's change management practices, and then let's see what happens. Today's management also isn't just about today's workers, because what today's management practices do is they also affect who leaves my agency and who comes. So today's management is also about tomorrow. The last thing I think we're wrong about is feeling hopeless. I'm in a lot of rooms where people talk about state capacity, making the state better. And it really seems like we think we probably can't do it. But maybe just like a little bit on the margin, we could make this one thing work a little better. I think that's nonsense. I think there's a lot we can do. I think there are paths forward. I just think they don't look like the same old thing we've been doing for 40 years, but harder. And that's what I'm here to pitch. Routine management can take a lot of forms. I've talked for a while, so I'm not going to go into these in depth. There are lots and lots of ways to allow autonomy, to cultivate competence, to create connections to peers and purpose. Some of them there's research on, right? Some of them are kind of observable implications of the model or of other things, or of other studies. But I have in the book 15 pages of suggestions, right? Some of these require changing rules. A lot of them don't. A lot of them just require doing things better. And some of them might involve adding, not subtracting rules, right? So we're used to thinking of rules as red tape. What about rules that say things like, use your best judgment, right? That say things like, your job is to help the citizen in whatever the best way possible is. Rules that can be used to defend, to empower. It's not an argument. It's an argument against rules as controls, rules as tools of compliance. We often need more empowering bureaucrats, huh? We often need empowering bureaucrats. And as academics, I think we need to study management and motivation too, more. We need to think about too much compliance possibilities more. As policymakers and bureaucrats, I think we need to seek out ways to shift towards more empowerment. As funders, I think we need to think about how to support and encourage management for empowerment. And what I think all of us can do, and one thing I'm working to do, is to support that shift towards more empowerment with practical offerings, with Route E managerial support for those agencies that want to do so. I think that has to begin with diagnosis of an agency, with prescribing shifts, with accompanying implementation, with embedded support, and with indicators and measurement tools that help that implementation. I'm by no means opposed to measurement. I'm by no means opposed to figuring out what's working. But we need to use that data as an input, not an answer into an accountability process. If I've convinced you at all of the need to improve this, please don't leave it there. Please help make this better. Finally, let me close with this gentleman, Pritam Ponnappa, social auditor in Coorg, right? Somebody who talks about the difficulty of being a good social auditor when all of the incentives he sees in the system pull him towards just reporting on targets and metrics that often miss the purpose of what he's trying to do. And why Pritam says he stays in the job is because he still matters. It's a place where his existence matters. That's where he wants to be. I think that's what all of us want in our working lives. Bureaucrats are no different. Let's help them make it so. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. One of the things we were talking about, in our discussion earlier, when we present the state capacity initiative, we often say not naive, but hopeful. So I think there's generally a room full of people who are not naive, but very much hopeful. And I think that that's in the spirit of the talk you've just given us. And I think, there'll be lots of questions, so I'm just going to open up. But I think one of the other things that struck me that it was very refreshing. And in case any of you are going to ask this particular question, maybe I shall preempt it so we can continue to keep it that way. But to be in a room where, you don't start with, this is about reform champions. This is about the charismatic leader. I mean, how many times have we heard in the development story that only worked because there was a charismatic leader or a head? Precisely why are the graphs good, or why are the statistics good? And you're like, of course, it led me to this great bureaucrat. And that's where we always start as well. Like, we eventually found this great bureaucrat at the top, but we think of them as one-off. The bug also, like the strange outlier. And I think what you're trying to do also in this book is, while there are lots of stories about individuals and narratives about their stories, and each of them will be unique, it's not to turn this into a story about charismatic individuals and charismatic leadership, which is simply like a bad word when we want to talk about scale and sustainability and other things. And somehow systemic reform is supposed to happen without them, which I've still never understood, because certainly, the thinking on that is from capitalism, and corporations don't happen without charismatic leadership too. So it's interesting how that you just decentered that, and it was really refreshing because you didn't even have to raise it to justify why this is important, right? So that was really exciting. But we'll have questions on Zoom, which I will collect shortly, and we can first open up maybe to questions in the room. There are already a whole bunch, but
Maybe I'll take
Neelan,
like
and then
three.
yeah,
three
we take
at a
three.
time.
Neelan, and then yourself, and then we'll.
So first, thank you. I mean, it was really very comprehensive talk. I think very convincing. And I think part of the reason why it's exciting is that we'd like to think, I think we'd like to think that the world is moving towards more supporting mission-driven bureaucrats. But I think the sense that sometimes we get in many of our contexts is that, in fact, a lot of what's being prescribed is much more aggressive compliance-based behavior. So it's a very important corrective. My question is, how do you think about the constraints on some of these mission-driven bureaucrats? So I can see that one set of constraints is definitely rules from the top. But one of the things that we think about a lot in India is that if you're a local bureaucrat, you might have constraints from the local dominant group. You might have constraints from the local business interest. So is there a way of thinking about empowerment which isn't necessarily the absence of certain kinds of rules and compliance, but maybe the right combination, which allows the local bureaucrat to get out of some of these challenges?
Just going to add to that, because our colleague Partha also sort of asked, I think, a question which is related, which is that how is the empowerment logic affected by political polarization? So that's the other side, which is, constraints.
Yeah.
This question of, yeah. Okay, sorry.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shivam, and I'm preparing for Indian Civil Services. And thank you so much. And my sincere apologies, I couldn't reach on time today. It was a pleasure hearing you, sir. And you so wonderfully explained that as management changes, so does the motivation. So my question was first that you said that, so is compliance always contrary to the motivation? Can't we have bureaucrats who are complying also and who are motivated also? And secondly, in societies like India, where still there is a lot of deprivation and where the society is not that much enlightened and civil, and the civility is lit, like I will explain, sir. So in these types of societies, doesn't the variable of enlightenment of the society matters when you are giving much room to the people? Like, sir, if I was just observing yesterday while I was traveling in Delhi metro, Delhi is a capital city and we have very educated people here. But still, we have to mention very basic things that, okay, give your seat to the women, be so much apart from the door, don't spit there. And still people are not giving seats to the women. They're sitting on the women's seats. So in societies like India, where there is so much of deprivation, and deprivation brings out the worst from the inside of the human being. So in societies like India, where you began to be very subjective and you began to give them more space, and when the power is already too much, so the risk of greater damage is also there. What are your views on that, sir? Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add to the kind of political polarization thing that Mikla brought up a little bit, that I think one of the things we see a lot working in India is that, I mean, the compliance is that you pick a side and you're politically aligned, and then maybe you're given space for empowerment, right? So kind of the empowerment is conditioned on political alignment of sorts, right? It's not in this vacuum, especially in some kind of democratically competitive system where you may be empowered for a period of time where you've picked the right side, and if the elections flip things, then things change all of a sudden. So, I mean, is it really possible to have consistent empowerment in societies which have political turnover, right? Or do you think that's, I mean, characteristics of systems have come up, and you have a lot of examples where it can be consistent despite political turnover? Because bureaucrats are often part of the same patronage networks, right? And sort of bring kind of political science and lots of politics into this. In some senses, their environment is created by the politicians, right? This isn't the black box separate from political life. The political life will condition it, and you will comply when necessary and be empowered when necessary. And that's actually them, the principal determining it. You're just working in the sandbox that they've created. But I'd love your reaction to that.
Yeah, thank you. These are great questions. Let me start with you and then turn to politics, which sort of unites the other three comments. So, which is to say, I couldn't agree more that deprivation brings out hardship. I don't know about the word, but you know that it doesn't have a salutary effect on the conduct of any individual. I guess I don't think this is an argument for some countries, but not others, right? And my sort of evidence for that would be I've seen nowhere where I have not seen examples of more empowerment leading to greater motivation and greater performance, right? So in the book, you know, it's not obvious to me that India, since that was, you know, the country your question's about, that it is more deprived than Nigeria. It is not obvious to me that India is more so than South Sudan, than Liberia, where I lived and worked for many years, and where we found that empowering management in a very direct way. I worked for the Minister of Finance there, and we found that empowering management was often quite effective. You know, I agree that people and cultures and places are different, right? But I want to push back, hopefully gently, on the idea that this is an argument that's appropriate for some kinds of people, but not others. I think people are people, and people want to have agency and see themselves make a difference in the lives of others. And I think there are plenty of Indian examples that point to that. And that is true not because India is particularly special, but because it's a country, right? I think this is an argument that applies to every country whose name begins with a capital letter. By that I mean every country. Right? So to the politics, definitely matters, right? I'm not here to tell you politics doesn't matter. You know, to parse the question on polarization, which I think might be your question, right? So Rohit and Parth are pointing towards, I think, what happens if politics is rotating and some people want some things and some people want others. Well, you know, I would say first that like management changes when politics changes, right? But the other sort of quasi-secret, maybe slightly obvious reason that I use Thailand as one of my cases here is because this is not an unpolarized polity, right? Indeed, much the opposite. I don't know of comparative cross-national polarization scores, but I would not be surprised to learn it is much more polarized than is India, right? And we see here a system that has been consistent in its empowerment, as far as I can tell. I don't have panel data, but I see no reason to believe it was any different 5 years ago or 8 years ago or 12 years ago. You know, in this case, in the Thai case, it's been achieved through decoupling, right? Through sort of removing the bureaucrats from the remit of the politicians. That's one way to do it, right? And that's the way actually the UK, where I now live, does it, right? Is that the civil service is largely apolitical. And I think that's often a very good thing. That said, I think in societies where the civil service is not at all apolitical, we also see this effect. And I guess I would say that, you know, in a world that was thinking maximally about this, for political reasons, we would see changes in who was empowered when, right? As politicians were interested in different kinds of things. But I guess I think that we're not at that frontier. And I think that in any political settlement, including the one that persists in India today, that it makes sense to think about more empowerment inside that system. And we may find that there are political limits to who wants to get empowered. But I would focus, you know, if I have one generalized complaint about political scientists, a group I'm often considered to be a member of, right? It's that we as a tribe focus on the things that can't be done at the limits, right? I think those limits exist. I think those limits are political, right? But I would like us to focus not on what is at the limit or where those limits lie, but instead on all the distance between where we sit and where those limits lie. And I think there's quite a lot of it. And to your question, Neelan, yes, I think there is a kind of combo effect. I'm not trying to argue that zero compliance and maximal empowerment is ever correct, right? I think the extent to which it is correct is probably going to depend on local political pressures,
Because of course, certain kinds of rules can empower bureaucrats to resist those pressures, right? Certain kinds of reporting requirements can be the reason I can't do the thing I might not otherwise think was in the best interests of aggregate welfare. That's the question. What's the right combo? You know, like any combo meal, like any fusion cuisine, it's going to involve elements of both. And if anything, that doesn't mean we'll have the same amount of empowerment or same degree or same flavor of empowerment in different contexts. It means we're going to have a lot more than the as close to zero as we can get. I think we often have today.
Just, I'm gonna just bring in a couple of Zoom questions as well, and then we'll go back to the thing. There's one question which actually again is on political polarization, but I think you've answered that one and its impact there. So have you observed a generalized association between mission motivation and being posted in one's home region, province, or district? Right, so that's one question. And then the second is actually asking you to address the question of trust. So the reason why compliance matters in bureaucracy is because there's a trust deficit starting from the top, policymakers till the last mile where policy gets implemented. People don't trust, so people at the top don't trust people at the bottom, hence they force the people below to comply. How do we overcome this trust deficit so that bureaucrats at all levels are mission-driven, not rule-driven? So it's the reason we have more. So I think maybe those two, and then we'll take up another round.
So I don't have systematic data on home posting and motivation. It's a good question. And I think it's an open one, and I think it's a publishable one. So I share what I take to be the hypothesis of the questioner, right? Which is that I think we will see such an association, right? Because people have greater identification with the work they do. So, you know, if it's connection to peers and purpose, we're going to feel, I mean, you know, when the city of Detroit called me and said, hey, we have a problem with child protective services, which is how I got involved. I'll be honest, I was more excited than had it been the city of Knoxville, Tennessee, right? Because I'm from one of those places, not the other. And I think most people are probably like me in that regard. But I don't have systematic data to show you. That's a good question.
Navigating by judgment, people who like to go far away sometimes, international aid, development.
I mean, that doesn't mean you can't have mission motivation elsewhere, right?
True,
so
true. But it's just saying there are people who could be motivated by it.
Of course.
Yeah.
People can be motivated by helping others, not just those who are far away. That's absolutely right. On the trust deficit, I think that's right. So like, you know, in fact, somewhere in the book, I say something like, ultimately, if I was to describe this argument in like one word, it would be trust, right? It would be that you should trust people, right? How do we overcome that deficit? I think slowly and through kind of proving that it works, right? Through increasing trust a little, and then a little more, and then a little more, right? You know, trust breaks down. So the number, I mean, forget about the public sector entirely. I think we see over and over again that organizations are high trust, then they get bigger and they add rules because all the people I know are trustworthy, but the people I don't know, they probably aren't, right? And it's a really interesting inference that like I've met all the good people. I've just gotten really lucky. And those other people who I haven't met yet, I'm not so sure about them, right? Maybe some evolutionary biologist. There's a wonderful LSE professor actually, who for all I know might be watching, but Michael Mulukrishna, right? It was a wonderful new book about kind of the evolution of human society and trust. Maybe there's something in there that'll explain why. I don't know why. But I agree that we need to rebuild trust. And I think we rebuild it slowly, you know, by showing that at this team level. So when I do it inside an agency, I say, look, let's start with something that you're pretty sure is going poorly, right? So if what I'm saying is full of nonsense, I can't make any worse something that really is not going well, right? So let's work with something that's not going real well. And let's see what happens if we trust those people and manage differently. And then that changes a little bit. Then, well, maybe we move to something that's going okay, right? And then maybe we move on to something that's going pretty good. And eventually you say, I don't trust the individuals. I don't know them, but I trust that this method is helping me. And this method is trust. And I think that's how we rebuild trust in a big system where it's like.
So questions from the room. I think there's a couple here and then two. So we'll take four. And let's do four and then.
Quickly, thank you, Dan. So
And
for
your
want of a, sorry,
Your name?
Sharbani, yeah, for want of a better phrase, say, how do we understand the system to system level translations, in the sense that I'm giving you 3 examples from the Indian policy realm, right? So one is that since the 1960s, our policy texts have talked about, our policymakers, they have talked about autonomy, bureaucratic flexibility, and bureaucratic discretion. This is there in our education policies and in every other policies. Now, we also talk about policies in a mission mode. That is a very common phrase. All right. So, so for instance, we had total literacy mission. We had Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. It's a movement. So it's and in these movement-oriented policies, several bureaucrats were totally committed and across states. However, it did not translate into systemic improvement, even when there was a mission mode commitment there. So how do we understand that? That's one thing. The second point is that what is the evaluative criterion of mission? When you say mission, again, Indian policy, where, for instance, and this actually aligns with your colleague Don Moynihan's somewhat issue of, administrative burden, where politics of a region, it forces a particular state to suppress welfare benefits for people from other states. So this is actually relates to that question about region as well, So, and that is common across Indian states, correct? So, and then I could not understand the issue of bureaucrats and politicians. They are, how does that dyad work in this kind of, in this relationship that you're talking about? Because in some states like Orissa, there is, so the bureaucrats control everything there, but that also undermines the political, the electoral democratic system. So yeah, so these are, again, all of these are Indian examples.
I was just going to add that the word mission has become very popular. This mission-driven bureaucrats, but there's mission with Matsukato talking about mission, and all of us in India, when we read it, were like, oh, no more missions. We don't want missions. We want systems to get better. But I think that's a little bit of the impulse of where your question also comes from. But we'll go around.
Okay, firstly, thank you for the session. My question is very much related to the first question that ma'am asked.
What's your name?
Pardon?
Your good name.
Oh, I'm Ojasvi. So what I have seen from my personal experience was that the way that, leaders try to drive results is through targets and through compliance. Now, we saw in the presentation as well that you have talked to some of these people and you realized that they were motivated. So how can they spread their motivation with their team members so that the tool that they have to use in the first place is not compliance but other managerial practices which can take the whole team along? So that is my question. Thank you.
First and foremost, thank you for an interesting and curiosity-inducing session. So my question is mainly on the transition or the shift of motivation from the entry level of the bureaucracy to the senior level. Whereas, especially in India, I'd say that getting into civil service at any stage, whether it's state or local as well, is very tough. So it's not generally a decision that anybody takes, just like continuing a family business or just another professional work. But then the initial roles are very much compliance based because they're junior and new and still training. And the more senior you get, you have more empowerment allotted by or given by the bureaucracy itself, because you have to take a lot of crucial decisions. But a lot of people in their initial years of being monitored or being operated by compliance-based management or management for compliance, their motivation gets somewhere either dwindled or weakened by the time they get senior, and they're operating more on the just as how things have been happening. They're less risk driven, less ready to take risks, or they're less open to innovations, or the different or the changes. They're most less open for the changes. So how do we see the balancing or the transition of the same person from their entry to the based on the compliance?
All right, so let me, lots of great questions. So, let me start at the beginning, with your fine question, Shivani. So I hear 4 questions, which I'm gonna try to take each a little bit quickly. So, the first is, we've been talking about autonomy for a long time. I don't see a lot of autonomy. What gives? And my answer is a little bit the question that followed yours, which is like, talking about autonomy and talking about exercising judgment is a little bit like talking about, oh, actually, since I've got the book right here. So I wrote a book before called Navigation by Judgment. It's fine. I'm not saying it for that. So at one point I was presenting at a data agency, and a unit director said to me, Dan, so excited that you're here. I love the book. We're doing this now. And I said, amazing. That's amazing. I would love to. Can I study it? Can I learn more? He's like, yeah, absolutely. I bought a bunch of copies of the book. No one needs to do that, by the way. I'm not suggesting that. So bought a bunch of copies of the book. I handed them out to a lot of people. And then I sent a memo instructing everyone to navigate by judgment. And I was like, oh, it's so close to being so, but no, you see how you can't just tell people. And that's sort of my answer to it's in the civil service trading guide, which is like, civil servants aren't dumb, right? They see a career where they are told one thing, but all the structural incentives and, implications run the other direction. And, when I say mission mode, I actually thought about saying something about this, because I do mean, as you say, I mean something very different than what the Indian state means by mission. I do think there's one bit where it connects, which is that mission mode is about we're trying to really accomplish something, right? And the reason I think you get people excited about that is because people are like, oh, some of us, that's what we're in it for. That's why we're here, is to accomplish something. And so what I mean by mission-driven bureaucrats is something like, the reason, so I would, my first pass diagnosis, at a overbroad level would be that we haven't seen systematic changes because the mission mode goes away. And then, and I mean by that, not that we should be in mission mode all the time, but that the thing that is leading to the change in mission mode, which is the sense that my actions have positive consequences on things, should be true more often, right? And if we systematized that, if we systematized opportunities for bureaucrats to feel like they were having impact, right? To feel like they were part of a positive process, we might see changes in motivation. We might see more of that impact. I talk at some length in the book about where missions come from. I have this theory of like a mission point. So mission point, think of it like almost sort of like a mission statement, though of course the statement doesn't need to well capture the mission, right? But something like the intersubjectively understood point that we think we're all here for. I think, what my colleague Don points out is that sometimes, and I would say there's a broader line of work, including some of what Rohit was alluding to, but also scholars like Terry Moe, right? Point out that sometimes politicians don't want an agency to work, right? So if politicians don't want an agency to work, it's probably not going to work. I think that is still the exception, not the rule. And to politicians and bureaucrats, obviously not something I can answer in 9 seconds, but broadly, I think that what managing for empowerment can do, it can help the agency realize whatever the current mission of the organization is. If that shouldn't be the mission of the organization, that is a kind of more societally contested thing, right? If politicians wish to shift that motivation, that's harder under a managing for empowerment mode, right? So one thing I think your question's just at the edge of is the idea that, mission-driven bureaucrats are a small c conservative force.
That is to say, if we have a bunch of people who feel they're empowered to deliver on a mission, it's going to be hard to shift them. Sometimes we might be excited about that. Say Trump's inability to keep the US Environmental Protection Agency from actually protecting the environment, despite his efforts not to do so. But we can also imagine cases that work in the other direction. And mission-driven bureaucrats are not a force for good per se. They are force for accomplishment of what they see the mission to be. And I think it is our great good fortune that I am willing to say that the vast majority of agencies and the vast majority of countries are doing things that I think is probably pretty good that we have somebody doing or trying to do. But it's an important point that it's not some sort of magic bullet that solves all problems, political or otherwise. How do we spread that mission motivation, right? First, fantastic. So, I mean, everyone loves questions that like suggest the questioner is bought in and now wants to know just how do we do this, right? And thank you for that. And so let's do more of that. That's a good idea. You know, I think there are a bunch of ways to do it, right? So one way, you know, there's this great study in Ghana, basically, where some of the managers asked their staff for suggestions on how things can get better, right? Turns out almost no one's ever been asked for a suggestion of how things can get better. It turns out that not all of them are good ideas, but some of them are. And then they implement those some and things get better. And then there are more suggestions, right? So like, you know, we do this at the team, at the local level, and it goes and it sort of spreads that way, right? We do it by creating a different team culture, right? So this great book, I mentioned it in passing, but I'll just say the name again, by Erin McDonald called Patchwork Leviathan, right? And what this book, it's sociology, right? And what this book is about is the idea that there are lots of high-performing teams all over the place. And when there are, it's because there are managers who manage differently than the rest of their organization, right? She doesn't frame it as a management text, but I think it could be. You know, I also have, you know, a dozen suggestions of tools and strategies managers can use. You know, same way you've motivated, I don't know, a community group, a student organization, right? So, you know, teams can be motivated. And, you know, the thing is, you don't have to convince people to do something they don't want to do, right? It's not like you have to take someone who doesn't want to be motivated and help them. What you have to do is give people who want to do good things the space to do so, which is a little bit how I think we get past. So, you know, I think, you know, I think I see the same elephant you do, right? Which is that I think I see a lot of people who I think, oh, you know, when I knew you a decade ago, I've now gotten to the age where I can think of examples of people who 10 years ago would have been on my list of mission-driven bureaucrats, which is, of course, a common, not a rare phenomenon, right? But now I'm not so sure, right? That said, there are lots of people who make it to senior levels and are still mission-driven. I think I've met some really fantastic, I suspect many people in this room have too, some really fantastic senior bureaucrats in state and, you know, national level cadres here in India and everywhere else in the world. You know, how do we make it easier? How do we stop that? Well, I mean, there's no magic bullet, but we do it one step at a time, right? And I think you'll find that people who in their first posting or their second posting are managed differently. And so imagine dream scenario, 5% of people are managed in a much more managing for empowerment way in their first and second postings, right? That doesn't mean they're given responsibility they're not ready for. It doesn't mean they're asked to make judgments they can't make yet, right? But they are fundamentally empowered and supported and things are discussed with them, not dictated, right? I suspect you will find that if that's 5% of your state cadre managed that way in the year of our Lord 2025, that come 2040, it will be much more than 5% of the senior managers who came from that. Because I think people who manage for empowerment and learn that, right, are the ones who pass it on. Because just the way, so how do you stop people passing on bad management? Well, you start managing better and teach them that, and then they'll start passing that on. And that's not going to solve the system today. There's no such thing that will, but it'll start creating the wedge that'll help it get better over time.
Yeah, I think we're well over time, but would you like to ask your final question?
So my question is just an extension of the politics question, and I've not articulated it very well in my own head. So as I go, which is that, so the question earlier was regarding political pressure from the outside, from the community or from politicians. But in increasingly polarized societies, bureaucrats themselves may also have certain political leanings. And especially when these differences exist along identity lines. And my understanding is that the Indian bureaucracy, but also bureaucracies elsewhere, are dominated by people from elite groups. If there's not, like there's some kind of an elite dominance, if not an elite capture. And how does increased management for empowerment interact with social justice concerns, like with respect to service delivery or regulatory or adjudicatory roles? Is there a risk here, perhaps, that managing for encouragement may increase the quality of service for some subgroups, but might also simultaneously risk baseline access to the same service for other subgroups that the bureaucrat is supposed to serve? Is that
Yes.
perhaps a risk? Is there a way to solve for it?
And I should take just that one. So, that's a great question and an extremely well articulated one. So I'd hate to see what well articulated looks like for you if that was a poorly articulated one. So the basic answer is yes. So, and I do actually talk about this in the book. That is to say, you know, anytime you give somebody more discretion, you allow them to exercise it heterogeneously, right? So that said, of course, with the right kind of managing for empowerment. So managing for empowerment is not the same as just giving somebody autonomy, right? So they will, with the right kind of managing for empowerment, you can manage those risks and you can think about that. I mean, one question we need to be asking ourselves is what services are rivalrous and non-rivalrous, by which I mean, so, you know, if currently no one's getting the service, and now some people are getting the service, and those people are people who share an identity label in your hypothetical, which is a totally plausible one, with the bureaucrat. In fact, to the extent I teach an Indian case in my core service delivery class, it's this. It's a profile, there's a wonderful profile of a bureaucrat in Ahmedabad, which works just this way. So he serves and facilitates access for people who share his identity label in this case, right? So if some people get better service and no one gets worse service, we could think that that's a problem. We could think it's not a problem, right? If somebody gets better service in a rivalrous good and thus other people necessarily get less good service, I think we all think that's a problem, right? I at least do. You know, I think this question of social justice and equity, you know, we don't want equity in the sense of no one getting any of the service, right? And I think we too often have equity in that unfortunate sense. And so one question is, what can we start moving forward on? And then how can we think about those things, right? And make those correctives. If we manage for empowerment well, actually, we will end up, and if we socialize the mission point correctly, right? Then we will end up with more people doing more things for more people than you might imagine. That said, I think these questions of equity and what happens when you give someone discretion. So I've made a very strong argument that when you give someone discretion, the idea that they will always use it for more ill than good is wrong, right? But will they use it for good equally amongst all people and amongst all things they could do? I think is a really important question that I think if we saw a lot more of this, the next set of research, you know, to me, the next book on this could be what happens when you have empowered bureaucrats, and when do empowered bureaucrats manage in the right political way, right? In different political contexts, when do they exercise their discretion in what kinds of ways, leading to what kinds of outcomes, and what kinds of second order effects by society and community groups, which then shape that. I think it's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a great discussion. I think everybody is looking forward to reading the book, even if we're not going to be distributing copies to everyone here. But it was really, really lovely. It's wonderful to have you at CPR. Thank you all for coming and spending the evening here as well, and to everyone on Zoom. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.